Hello, this week's topic is on financialized futures, or why don't late capitalist wages provide for the basics of life. So as usual, I'm going to break it up into three parts. Firstly, to start with a kind of broader conceptual understanding about the consumption of credit and the financialization of everyday life and the way that affects young people's lives. The second part and third parts are both kind of empirically driven, the research we've been doing in our center recently. Firstly, about how debt affects young people's attitudes towards the future. And the third part will be about the gamification of debt, particularly around buy now, pay later products. So let's get into it in terms of part one, the consumption of credit and the financialization of everyday life. So basically, there's been some broader concerns about how social change over the past 20 or 30 years has seen debt itself become increasingly normalized as a way to live. People increasingly go into debt for all kind of manner of different things that in previous generations that wouldn't have been so much the case. And also the idea that like life itself is being financialized. More and more of our aspects of life are used to create money and create profit, particularly through internet and clicks and the immaterial labor stuff that we've looked at throughout the course so far. But also the way that people are encouraged now from an early age to think about themselves as kind of entrepreneurs of their own human capital, and kind of almost like learn to love the grind, work hard, and kind of ceaselessly hustle. This kind of relentless churn of pursuing, enough finance, not just to live, but to have all the things that we need and desire beyond what we need. Financialization here means that credit becomes just another tool to kind of move through that youth transitional period. And it's not just for kind of, instant gratification consumption products, just buying new shoes or records or whatever. It's increasingly going to credit for the basics of life, particularly with education now, with such a huge debt after higher ed and stuff like that. So the access to credit has become more easier, like particularly with the rise of things like buy now, pay later products, many of which people don't actually see as forms of debt. But it's also become more of a necessity, and debts are becoming bigger and bigger. So this means that, aspects of our life are constantly we have to make decisions about like paying the debts off, rather than just kind of, being able to kind of buy a house. It's not just about the life that you have in the house. You have to commit yourself to, being able to pay off that debt. So this also means that credit itself, forms of credit, different kinds of it, are things that are increasingly consumed. So you need to assess them, and there's like different regulations about how you can do that, but it's becoming easier in many ways to access forms of debt. And so debt itself, almost like, different brands of shoes or clothing or different bands that you like or TV shows that you watch, you have to choose between them. You almost have to choose forms of debt that more represent yourself, or, become something that you're more comfortable with, or particularly with the marketing of these things, you can see how they're, with different buy now, pay later products, for instance, are advertised more towards men or women or different classes or different races. So financialized capitalism kind of creates value through those immaterial forms of racialization, gender, and class that we've looked at through the course so far. But the very kind of subjectivity and production of youth today is formed, or at least part of it is formed, through credit and debt technologies. So young people have to invest themselves in various activities to be able to create a life, invest yourself in education, invest yourself in making yourself a better person and being fit and having the right CV and all this kind of stuff. And this kind of also mirrors the logic of having to invest in this kind of forms of credit that you need to access many of the things that we desire. So there's distinctions, like in that Borgesian sense, that happen through access to credit and debt. Some people can access it easier than others. They're easier than others, can therefore buy things more readily than others. As we looked at last week, for instance, the work that Julia Cook's been doing shows the different ways that kind of more wealthy, privileged kids can team up with their parents and find all kinds of strategies to access debt in fairly creative ways that also minimize the interest and minimize the problems around debt. So in this sense, very concretely, credit is therefore something that we consume as a kind of product now, as much as a kind of service to access to consume. So many of the kind of more broader social theorists kind of show now that we're all debtors now. We're all in debt in some way. Most people can't really get through life with going into debt, whether that's small credit card type stuff to day-to-day things, whether it's having a mortgage, a loan for a car, a HECS debt. All these things are now very, very normal part of life. But like in terms of the way this works in power, being in debt means that you kind of have to invest yourself in this kind of financial logics. Financial logics becomes intertwined with the basic activities of everyday life. And for critical theorists, this means that this kind of obviously very much socially reproduces already existing inequalities. It can make them more intense, and it means that some people are included from normative consumption more so than others, dependent on whether you have access to this debt. But more broadly, the likes of Lazzarato have argued that we're all debtors now. We're kind of guilty and responsible in the eyes of capital. We have to therefore pay capital back for being so generous to be able to lend us the money we need to actually access many of the basic facets of life. So the quote there from Lazzarato says, "The promise of neoliberal capitalism, where the figure of Homo economicus would flourish as a shareholder and entrepreneur, has decomposed into an existential condition of being at once responsible and guilty for one's particular fate. Credit, debt, these things become the way that you can have some control over these things, but they also therefore kind of trap you in a life of exploitation and domination by those very things that give you access to those things." So this very much echoes, the Foucauldian perspective of debt as a technology of the self. So fiscal interactions are emotionally intense. There's a lot of pressure involved in these things. There's a lot of imagining of how you can use debt to access things in the future. So debt as technology in this of the self in this Foucauldian sense, in the way that kind of is accessed through technology, phones, apps, ATMs, digital networks, and the like. But it also therefore becomes its kind of technology of discipline. Once you kind of have these debts, they kind of discipline you to behave in specific ways to service that debt. So one of the, I think a great paper on this is Ash and colleagues' work about how credit services increasingly kind of create a frictionless experience. They use data, they use kind of design to try and help modulate people's behaviors to access more and more debt, to make it feel like you're not going into debt, to make it feel like it's just kind of another consumption experience. But this then has, more deeper consequences. In our research that we'll show in the later parts of this lecture, the young people that we spoke to have a really broader range of emotional experiences when it comes to this stuff. Debt and credit can, offer you some ease, offer you some enjoyment, offer you some gratification. There's ambivalence, there's suspicion, but many kind of emotionally oriented towards big debts in particular, with fear, and some even use the word terror, that it kind of is really scary going to these big debts to be able to and you're not sure how you're going to pay it off. Again, particularly because things like the labor market are so insecure and precarious. So this leads us to think about how the future is affected by imaginaries of debt. Our work in our research project kind of extends the work of others here. Then there's a bunch of readings there that I'm not going to go into, but you'll be able to access them through the course guide. Debt becomes mediated, payday loans and credit cards, a set of techniques, resources, cluster of promises that entangle now in everyday forms of living. People that are in debt often feel this embodied attachment to the debt, kind of a pressure, a guilt around it as well. And imaginaries of debt kind of affect the way people orient towards the future generally. So this obviously has kind of real repercussions for the way that we imagine youth transitions, a kind of central thing that's the concern of the course. And I'll show you some data in a minute that kind of shows how the future can feel kind of foreclosed or opened by different orientations towards debt. In our work, and you can see again the papers that we've written on this, we can see debt is kind of a moral economy. There's good and bad debts. Debt has a temporality effect in the way that it kind of makes you feel now and how it orients you into the future. And feelings of debt have very real implications on one's well-being. So again, we have some papers that you can read in the course guide if you want to look at that in more detail. Okay, I'll leave it there and come back and present some of the research data that we've collected and written about on this topic.